Hello, and welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott. This is program number 23 in our series on the Christian basics. We are just at the very end of the first major section with lesson 16, which is called Church History. Now, the next program, we're going to be beginning section 2, and which we call Arguments and Conversations. And we'll be beginning another section where we're looking at something a little bit differently, but very important part of what belonged to Christian basics. But here we are now, number 23, lesson 16, church history. There's a history. And where does that history start? Well, the introduction points out that Christian history begins with Genesis and the first humans. I used to get quite excited about origins and love to debate the various options that were open to Christians. And I unhappily would run into, on both the left and the right, people who were absolutely certain it was this on the right, who were generally in the Christian community. And then on the other extreme were people on the far left who sometimes were in the general overall Christian community. Well, sure, it's over here. This is it. And the rest of you you're off, and the people on the right look and say, well, no, you're not taking it right, you're misinterpreting, and you don't have it at all. And I don't know which side was more problematic. And I have to confess that at one time I was over here on the far right, and then I was on the far left. I was actually on the far left before I was on the far right. I went major pendulum swing. I'm sort of back here now. I realize that salvation doesn't depend on our theology. It doesn't depend on the doctrine that we hold, especially about origins and creation. But church history, in my view, starts with Genesis. God dwelt with an Adam and Eve. However you want to look at all that, it's okay. But I believe they were actual people, and God was in fellowship with them. That meant that was church to me. You know, there's all kinds of interpretations to this, and probably most Christians say that the church really began on Pentecost, that which the prophets Jeremiah in 31 and Ezekiel 37 and Joel 2 and so on were looking forward to. This particular time when the Holy Spirit would indwell the people of God, they would belong to Him, and they say that's the church. Well, since there is no definitive statement in the church that says this is when the church started, then we have some openings to be of differing opinions. And I think that's a healthy sort of thing. One of the specialties that I've studied over the decades in my ministry is the impact of the cultic mentality. And part of that is demanding uniformity in doctrine. If you vary, well, you're probably not biblical, you probably are not even Christian. That sort of mentality that everything is rooted on what one actually believes the Bible teaches, not whether or not someone is safe in Christ and has passed from death to life. But so there are varying views on when the church began. There's another debate in regard to Israel. Is Israel different from the church? The church different from Israel? And people have varying views on that, and sometimes, unhappily, they become quite upset if you disagree with them, if you hold an opposing position. I've held two major positions: replacement theology and no replacement theology. And I don't think I'm going to bother telling you where what position I have right now, because it really is relevant in so many ways. But in any case, and I ask for forgiveness for those people who I've offended just now, but I hope we can get over it, move past it, and take a wider, broader look at the history of the church. But I consider that the history of Israel is also the history of the Christian church. It is one. It's all found in the same book, isn't it? Christianity grew out of Judaism and is intimately connected to that whole history. Indeed, all the way back to Adam and Eve, the first persons who make up the story, the initial storyline of the Bible. So we have this long history. In regard to Adam and Eve, I don't know of a date. There are those who are quite sure they know the date. There was a time when I was sure that I knew the date. On further study, I decided I didn't know the date, and I realized I didn't have to know the date, or the date would have been supplied and would have made a big deal out of it. You got to know the date or of creation, or there's something wrong with you. I don't find those words. But whatever it was, they existed, and we're going to be looking at timelines in this program, timelines of some of the major characters, beginning with Abraham, because with Abraham we start to know some of the datings that come to us in a number of different ways. But in terms of Adam and Eve, Enoch, Noah, the flood, we're uncertain about these things. And it probably doesn't really, Christianity does not depend on where we place these events. But that they were events is a different story, because the Bible is quite clear on those things. And the stories surrounding these are vital to the whole of the biblical story. Not just the Old Testament either, but also the New as well. So we look all the way back to Adam and Eve and on through to Abraham. Let's see if we can get, Katie, that timeline, that initial Old Testament timeline up. I know I sprang this on her, and she has been working on it diligently. And so there it is, Adam and Eve. We don't have any real information. Let's just say a long time ago. But when we get to Abraham, now we've got something a little more solid. When someone asks me, when did Abraham live? I usually just say 2150, but we have some wider range then. They lived from about 2166 to 1991. Now this is not recent. This is 4,000 plus years ago. This is what we call the BC, before Christ, or BCE, if you would prefer, before the Common Era. Long time ago, 4 millennia ago, this man was an Abru. He belonged to a little tribe that eventually was designated Hebrew after the Abru word had gone through a number of changes. So this is Abraham, and a real history of that we can begin to pinpoint, both in terms of a timeline, but also culture, language, events. This goes back then, and I want to emphasize how important it is to know the timelines, especially for preachers and teachers. It's a little disconcerting to hear preachers and teachers give odd dates, sometimes missing it by 1,000 or more years for some of the dates of some of the key biblical figures. And I like to tell my teachers and preachers that work with us, be sure you understand the biblical timelines. Vital that we understand those. So So we're starting here with Abraham. We've got a definite time period. And now we're going to go to Joseph. Now, Joseph would have been Abraham's great-grandson. Abraham's son that the line goes on is Isaac, and then Isaac's son Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. So we know that Jacob and Israel are really the same individual. And then we have on the screen Joseph, 1915 to 1805, in that time range. And Joseph was the son of Jacob, the coat of many colors, who was sold as a slave into Egypt. and eventually, the events that happened with Joseph led to all of the nation of Israel, all 70 of them at that point, coming to Egypt for a period of about 400 years. So we have that period of Joseph. Then one of the next major events to take place is we call the Exodus and Moses. Now, there are those who differ with this viewpoint and place the Exodus about 200 years later on, in the 13th century BC. But I believe it was in the 15th century BC, the Exodus. This is where Israel, all the people of Israel, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, left Egypt on the way to the Promised Land. And the 40-year wandering in the wilderness would have taken place then. And so we have a next significant date of around 1406 with the entrance into Canaan. Now, I want to say something here, that in my time, and I have looked at archaeological events, discoveries as well, and as much material that someone like myself, time-wise, has the capacity to look at and examine. And I know that those who opt for 200 years later, in the 13th century instead of the 15th century BC, they have their good arguments as well. And I would not fight long and hard over my position. But it seems from really biblical concerns and issues, I opt for the more ancient period of Israel as a nation, led by Joshua, crossing the Dead Sea, Moses' death at that point, and his lieutenant right-hand man Joshua led the people of Israel across the Jordan into the Promised Land and began the period of the Judges. The period of the Judges, which lasted for some time. This would have been the days of Deborah and Samson and numbers of others. So this is an important feature here on the timeline, but I want to make clear that there are good scholars who have other views on this. Okay, now we're going to get to the first kings of Israel. Israel wanted to be like all the other nations, and they wanted a king to rule over them, probably in order to fight their battles, because it was a war-like time. The 7 nations of Canaan, the Canaanites, the valley people lived there, and there was a long history of warfare amongst the various tribes. And so here we have the first king, first person designated through the prophet Samuel. Saul was the first king, and he reigned from that period, about 1050 to 1030 to about 1010. To about 1010. That's a good date to put Saul. Now, the next king was David. And I always round David off to 1,000. Just makes it a little easier for me. But David reigned about 1010 to 971, quite a long time. And that was when Jerusalem became the capital. David's palace was built, and plans were beginning to be put forth for the building of the great temple in Jerusalem. So David. Then we move to David's son Solomon, and his reign from 971 to 931. Solomon. It's this period that the temple was built. The Ark of the Covenant was moved into the Holy of Holies. That's where the Ten Commandments were. And that magnificent structure was created. It was nowhere near what it became during Herod the Great's day, which the temple was so expanded and redone to earn a credit as one of the seven ancient wonders of the world. Please put that date of Solomon back on, because there's another date there, the 931, that is a big deal. This is when the kingdom of Israel was divided. There was a civil war, and Rehoboam and Jeroboam, it's not possible really to go into all of that, but Solomon's reign deteriorated. There was a civil war, and finally the 10 northern tribes broke away, established their capital at Samaria, and the two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, they became known as Judah, and the capital was Jerusalem. This was 931. The kingdom is divided. And so you have in the Bible now, we have two histories. You'll have the history of the kings of Israel, or sometimes called Ephraim or Ephraim. That's the northern 10 tribes, and then the southern 2 tribes, Judah. But then in 722, the Assyrians, who were a major powerhouse at that point, they came and took capture and just dismantled the 10 northern tribes, just dismantled them in what we would call a dispersion. This happened in 722. 722, a little more than 200 years after the division of the kingdom. The capital was Samaria, and there was a rival temple in Samaria, and so the 10 tribes as an official entity disappeared in 722, never to come back. The southern kingdom fell to the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, 586, and then there was a series of conquerings, the Medes, the Persians, and there was a period of time, 70 plus years, where Jerusalem was virtually uninhabited, the walls broken down and the temple destroyed. And then through the ministry of Nehemiah, Ezra, and others, Jerusalem was rebuilt, and then went through a series of other foreign countries taking control. Alexander the Great, the Greeks after that, one of the Egyptian Alexander's generals, they got Egypt was under that area was under control of Egypt, and then later that's the Ptolemies and the Seleucids in Syria, and so there was a series of people who occupied Israel up until the time in the first century, then the Romans, and now we move to the period of the days of Jesus, and that is now we look at the New Testament timeline. Katie, I'm just going to ask you to just continue to put them up. And Jesus is born oddly about 5 BC. There's been some recent work on that, saying that it was closer to what we all thought was the real date, 0 or 1, but there's real evidence to indicate that our calendar is a little bit off, and Jesus was born about 5 years before Christ. In AD 8, Jesus visits the temple when he's about 12 years old, an important date. And then Jesus' ministry began 28 or 30, depending. And so that was the period of time when he lived in Nazareth. Then 28 or 29, John the Baptist ministry at the Jordan River begins. And so Jesus is about 30 years old. And so the ministry in Judea, which is the latter part in Judea, about 30. Then in about 33 to 30, Jesus returns to Judea, and the crucifixion and the resurrection take place. 33, 34, Paul is converted and begins his ministry, first missionary journey with Barnabas, 46, 47 AD 46, 47. The Apostolic Council in Jerusalem, as we find out in Acts 15, AD 48, 49. And Paul's second missionary journey with Silas in that period, 49 to 51. And let's see, Peter goes to Rome, 50, 54. Paul's third missionary journey between the years AD 52, 57. Mark's gospel is written in the early 50s, probably, the first gospel written. Matthew's gospel probably written 55 to 65, a decade in there, it's hard to know. The reign of Nero, 54 to 68, and this is during the time that both Peter and Paul would be crucified, probably, but then there's evidence that Paul managed to conduct another missionary journey, and actually goes to Paul's voyage to Rome as a prisoner. And Paul in Rome under house arrest. Luke's Gospel and Acts written about 62, 63. 64 was the big fire in Rome. Nero blamed the Christians. There was a scattering of the Christians. Peter and Paul are martyred in Rome, as I missaid earlier, but this is the more correct. 64 to 67, Peter and Paul martyred in Rome. Between 89 and 95, John's Gospel is written, and probably shortly after that, the last book of the New Testament was written, the book of Revelation. So this gives us certain ideas about the general timeline. Now, there's another history that I want to get to just briefly, and that is the history of Christian thought. By the way, that is a title of a book written by Jonathan Hill that was published in 2003 by InterVarsity Press. There's the timelines, there's the things that occurred at certain periods that we have pretty good ideas that took place, but there's also a history of Christian thought. Every doctrine has a history to it. It just didn't spring out because the Bible, remember, doesn't have direct doctrine stated in it. We have a lot of evidence that points to all kinds of things. But the church, the Christians through the centuries wrestled with these things, wrestled with what they meant. Like, who is Jesus? What is salvation? What does the Bible teach about sin? What does the Bible say about human beings? What does the Bible say about the end of the world? So many of these doctrines that we find that in some of the early creeds, like the Apostles' Creed, which is a 3rd or 4th century document, but is dependent on the old Roman symbol that probably goes back into the 2nd century. There's one church, but there's a number of different creeds, a number of ways of saying, I believe. So we have the Apostles' Creed. We have the Nicene Creed. We have the Heidelberg Catechism. And my favorite, frankly, outside of the Apostles' Creed, is the Canons of Dort. And there was the Council of Trent, and so on and so forth. Well, there's a history to all of the things that we believe. And although it is nowhere near possible, the Christian Basics would be extended for months to go through this. Most of these books are very thick, but it's very valuable to see how they developed. But anyway, and every Bible seminary student, Bible school seminary student is going to go through that kind of thing. So we find the history of what happened, the Protestant Reformation. Who was Martin Luther? What did he do? Well, the Baptists, people like me, where did they come from? Who in the world are the Puritans? About the Quakers, the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Unitarians, who were they? They were big questions, big answers. Well, that we find in the history of Christian theology. The early things, the Gnostics, were a group that were around and challenged the church and made the church make up their minds about who is Jesus. The Arians, the same way, who denied the deity of Christ. And so the councils had to figure out by looking at the Bible, who is this? Who are the Nestorians and the Moravians? Who are some of the great people in all history? Justin Martyr, Ignatius, Tertullian, Origen, Augustine, the great Augustine, Jerome, Benedict, Anthony, Aquinas, Martin Luther, John Calvin, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, Billy Graham, on and on and on. We have some of the great personages of history: Charles Haddon Spurgeon, David Martin Lloyd-Jones, some of the great writers and preachers and theologians of our day. And the church has a rich, rich history, and I encourage people to do that, to look at it. Now this, what I've said, is just a teaser. It's really an invitation to dig deeper, and the result will be far more settled understanding of where the church is right now. It's akin to knowing the family history. It's both good and bad, but it's our history. So long.